All right, I want to welcome all of you to the first of our 2014-15 MA program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies lecture series. We have Dr. Robert Skloot here to my right, who is our fall 2014 Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Scholar in Holocaust Studies. Dr. Skloot is indeed a very distinguished scholar. His area is theater. Now, we've never had anybody who taught in our Holocaust and Genocide Studies program whose expertise was theater and drama. But that's Bob Skloot's expertise. He has spent a long career at the University of Wisconsin, where he was a professor as well as an assistant chancellor, I think, provost, associate vice chancellor from 1996 to 2002. He's the author of numerous articles, and he's written a number of plays, and he received 5 or 6 Fulbright scholarships. I mean, that is like really extraordinary. So we feel very privileged to have Dr. Skloot with us today, and he will be speaking about Raphael Lemkin and the fight against genocide. So with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Dr. Skloot, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Carol. Glad to be here and to lead off an exciting series. The perspective I want to take today is perhaps not one that's usual, and that, as Carol mentioned, it might be because I come from an area which isn't usually associated with the teaching or discussion of Holocaust and genocide, though I hope to think that more and more people are doing it that way. In fact, I know that's the case because a number of them who are doing it are former students of mine, which feels very good to me. So let me begin. I think my remarks will take about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions, because I'll be happy to respond to some of the queries that come through that may have to do with Lemkin himself, may have to do with the treaty, may have to do with the context for the treaty, historical, political, and otherwise, and so forth. We'll wait and see what happens then. Most of us are familiar with the condition of anonymity in our too public age because, entirely appropriately, we lead our lives in private. Mostly we're among friends and family with no hope or interest in a cover story or a centerfold in a national magazine or on a reality TV series that's written around us. Other people, they may be called celebrities. About them, everything from their weight to their tattoos to their dating habits and eating habits become grist for the insatiable media, who will grind them up very finely in short order. And then there are those who inhabit a shadowy area, neither the focus of the public's attention nor entirely absent from it, but who exist on the margins of public notice and whose obituary, when it appears, reminds us that at one time, somewhere in the past, there was a recognition of their name and face and voice, though not any longer, and perhaps it never happened for too long. Raphael Lemkin was one of these men in the middle by virtue of the fact that in his 59 years of life, he moved between the extremes of notoriety and anonymity, but mostly stayed in the shadows. He also, importantly, moved often, actually and metaphorically, physically and psychologically, whence the name of this talk I'm presenting today, Wandering with Firm Purpose. When Lemkin died in 1959, and there are 3 different reports about where he was when he died, his modest-sized obituary in the New York Times called him genocide's foe. And the title caught well his generalized status between the attention given a world citizen and the then little-known details of his personal life. For although Lemkin was on a first-name relationship with the world's most influential political leaders for more than a decade before his death, he held no official portfolio and served as an emissary for no one other than himself and his obsession to ensure through a process of law that the slaughter of innocents would be prevented, and if not prevented, then severely punished. It was this monomaniacal cause that broke his health and finally, I believe, killed him. Thereafter, it took little time for him to fall into obscurity. And so this talk today is an attempt for you to get to know this extraordinary man and his work, to know them both better, and to do that by referring, as I will, to a play that I wrote about him in 2006. To some extent, I fall into the assessment of Lemkin's work that Dirk Moses calls the hagiographic imperative. But the effort is not without its importance, as you may discover at the reading that we're planning to give of the play for the Richard Stockton audience, citizens here, tentatively scheduled now for the 8th of December. It is this unattached, unaffiliated Lemkin that interests me because in his solitary status, I see the basis for the vagaries and oddities of his life's geographical and professional trajectory that had him in constant movement for the last 2 decades of his unmoored existence. His is the extraordinary and mostly forgotten historical career that tempted me to write a play about him. For his astonishing political achievements call out for greater analysis and attention, as do his personal struggles that caused him much misfortune and conflict. Once a minor figure on the world stage, it was my hope to make him a major figure on the theater's stage. And so what follows now is a brief analysis of Lemkin's life and his work, and some thoughts about the challenge of bringing his story and his person to theatrical life. Lemkin was born in northeastern Poland in a rural area. His education early was greatly influenced by his mother, Bella, who guided his reading and intellectual attention in his formative years. His devotion to her was well known. As a young man, he adhered to a relaxed kind of Judaism and sought to deepen and strengthen his intellectual capacities through travel and higher education. He was a wandering Jew, though not always by choice, as was typical of Europe's Jews in the middle decades of the 20th century. He was a rigorous student of both international law and languages, and then a teacher who used both disciplines to achieve considerable professional success. He not only mastered several fields of law, as well as the essentials of political science, history, and economics, but he could also, with ease and fluency, think and speak in Polish, Latin, Greek, Spanish, Swedish, Italian, Yiddish, Hebrew, French, and English, of course, and he knew at least some Arabic and Sanskrit. Wandering Jews and merchant seamen, of which I was once one in the summer of 1964, keep packed suitcases by their beds. But only the former might see the necessity of being home in the world by being home in many languages of the world. So, after the completion of PhD degrees in philology and law from Lvov and Heidelberg, Lemkin began work as a public prosecutor in Warsaw. establishing his credentials and reputation as an expert in a number of subfields of international law. An anecdote is told by Dr. William Corey, a Lemkin commentator, that many years after Lemkin reported attending an international law conference convened by the League of Nations in Madrid in 1933, he wrote he never actually appeared there. I like the anecdote because we might say that Lemkin was both a time and a space traveler, both present and absent. But it's certain that his presence was known in Madrid through a prescient and deeply insightful paper that he wrote for the conference, a paper that prefigured his work on the Genocide Treaty, though at the time Lemkin called the mass slaughter of innocents the crime of barbarity. This becomes a rather important word to him and later in the literature, though by the time you get to the promulgation and approval of the treaty, some decade and more later, that term had long fallen from Lemkin's lexicon. Years later, in the final text of the treaty, approved in 1951, Lemkin set forth the idea of a universal jurisdiction for the crime of genocide, a condition that's made explicit in the 6th article of the Convention. That is, in the Genocide Treaty, Lemkin was successful in getting adopted the worldwide responsibility for the punishment of these heinous crimes, irrespective of national boundaries. This is enormously important. An astonishing legal accomplishment. That is to say, genocide could be committed anywhere, and those who committed it could be brought for legal action wherever they committed it. Through his single-minded efforts, he prevailed in the idea that crime could be assessed outside the particular borders of where murder was committed, and by people not connected to that place. The world would be that much closer, he thought, to the international justice which he perceived and pursued in his lonely, continuing, obsessional mission. For a playwright, recreating Lemkin's life poses a number of challenges. To be sure, because of his semi-public stature, much is now known about his work. I read most of his correspondence in the files kept by a colleague of mine at the University of Alabama, who had photocopied the documents from the 3 archives where they are held across the United States. It's not the best place to spend July in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, but nonetheless, it served an important function for me. The first credible and unbiased full-length biography appeared only in 2008, a work by John Cooper called Raphael Lemkin and the Struggle for the Genocide Convention. And that book, in my opinion, is written in a rather pedestrian style and overfilled with the tiny and larger details of Lemkin's struggle to get the treaty approved. Cooper himself, in this book, recognizes the gaps in Lemkin's story, and he does provide the geographical outlines of Lemkin's life. It was in the 1940s that his most important book, called Axis, Rule, and Occupied Europe, was published. That book detailed the ways in which Nazi Germany used the law. It's a great achievement. What Lemkin did, nobody else even thought of. He had correspondents throughout Europe, even during the Nazi occupation, who sent to him files in the United States, files, documents, somehow they got them out, to send to him, which talked about what kind of law the Nazis were establishing in all of the countries in Europe. And then Lemkin then did a study of those laws. He detailed the ways in which Nazi Germany used law, in this case its own law, a new version of law, to rule and subdue the countries it occupied. In that book, which was published in 1944, he coined the word genocide. You may know the anecdote. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, said shortly before this time that there was no word in the English language for which we could call this wholesale slaughter of innocents, as I call it. Well, Lemkin fixed that problem. So he coined a word, genocide, taking the two syllables, one from the Greek, one from the Latin, geno as a tribe or a grouping of peoples, and side as death, of suicide, and so forth. Creating this new word, and in his files, in his papers, there's a wonderful letter, I think it's an amusing letter, right, sent to Lemkin by, I believe it's the Merriam-Webster Dictionary Company in 1951, saying that they have decided to put his word in their dictionary. He was very pleased with that. Pleased in a way which I'll capture in a moment when I think more about, or speak more about Lemkin and his person. Because one of the components of this talk has to do, in fact, with how it is we come to know Lemkin on stage as a full individual, a character who has something to say to us and who makes himself meaningful to us. Perhaps the most dangerous years of Lemkin's wandering with firm purpose began early in 1940, when he fled Poland for Sweden, where he took up the post of the professor of law. His time there was brief. The war started, as you know, in September 1st, 1939. He was wandering again, this time through the Baltic, through Latvia, Lithuania, and utilized some networking to get this position as a professor of law at the University of Uppsala, for which he learned Swedish in 6 months or 6 weeks or something in order so he could teach in Swedish. His time was brief, and he traveled back to Poland to see his family, detaching himself from them before they were destroyed. All 49 of them, save for one brother, Elias, who survived the war as well. This murderous onslaught of the Nazis moved east. He speaks, and you can read about it in the autobiography, which was published this year by Yale University Press. An interesting little ironic detail, since it's the university that employed him in the United States, unhappily so for him. Now as the publisher of his autobiography, which had, as I say, been distributed in this manuscript throughout 3 libraries, and finally put together, I think ably so, by an editor named Donnelly Fries. He speaks of his escape first at the start in the bombing of Poland, when the Luftwaffe came over Poland in the first week of September 1939, trapped for a while on a train as the bombs fell, managing through luck, extraordinary luck, but also through perseverance and not a little courage, for him then to make his exit through forests and otherwise to various places where he could find at least a modicum of freedom. His escape through Russia in 1941, for when he had come to see his parents for the last time and bade them a farewell, thinking in fact this might be the last time he would see them. They refused to accompany him, believing, as so many Jews did at the time, that they would somehow be protected by whatever reason, by divine intervention, if not through luck or politics, that he would then say goodbye to them sorrowfully, and with, again, a great amount of courage, leave Poland to the east by moving through Russia, finally taking a train which brought him across to Siberia, finally by boat to Japan, and then on a boat going from Japan to the United States, where he landed in Vancouver and then took a train across, coming to settle in Durham, North Carolina, where his first American job, again through networking, was taken up at the University of North Carolina, Duke University in North Carolina. This risky escape, which he managed successfully, and then to find his next refuge in the United States via Siberia, Japan, and Seattle. Vancouver, Seattle. Later years saw him working with the War Department in Washington, It's a name that we don't use anymore, but I think perhaps we might, with better selection, calling our department in Washington a Department of War, as well as taking up a teaching position in Yale. He worked on the legal staff of the American delegation at the Nuremberg trials. As I wrote in my note to the play, If the Whole Body Dies, and this is a cover image from the play, and this is now a website which accompanies the play, and if you're interested in knowing more about Lemkin, his life, the play, references to Lemkin, it's all up there and you can find it. I wrote in my note to the play, we know a lot about Lemkin from those who knew and wrote about him, and of course from what he wrote about himself. Off and on through the 1950s, he put time to writing his autobiography, I just mentioned it, which he called Totally Unofficial. That was the name he gave to his autobiography. He took that from a phrase describing him in a New York Times editorial in 1957. As I say, the book was never finished, and it exists in several revisions, as if Lemkin couldn't stop himself from tinkering with this story, this narrative that moves between remarkable personal experience and extended historical disquisition. These drafts are interesting because they exist in ways that we have, many of you here have no knowledge of how this is a pre-computer time. So we have pages that are just crayoned out, marked out, you know, paragraphs are gone, notes written in the margin, and so forth. It seemed to me that in reading all this, it doesn't improve any as he keeps doing all this, as we hope our writing will. But the essential story, which he does finally get to tell, and which is, I say, well edited in the volume that was published this year, does give, I think, in some ways, a very exciting story about his life and travail, accomplishments and disappointments. It was the early chapters of Samantha Power's important book of 2002. She now is, as you know, the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Her book called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. It was that early chapter that reestablished Lemkin as the important progenitor of the international attempt to deal with the subject that he himself named. In 2009, the Center for Jewish History in New York mounted a splendid exhibition dedicated to Lemkin's life and his accomplishments, which furthered the goal of making Lemkin's work more widely known. Lemkin's own correspondence and other writing reposes, I say, in a number of places, and much of it is now online, and it's easily accessible for researching. In fact, I should tell you, I have to be fair about this, there is another play about Lemkin, which was written the same year as my play was, written by a good friend of mine named Catherine Phillot. Her play is called Lemkin's House. Our plays have a certain resemblance because both of us use the same sources for our research, but in length and in tone and in purpose, they are very, very, very different theatrical works. It's because the undeniable significance of Lemkin's contribution to historical and legal studies is now widely acknowledged that a number of commentators, myself included, have seized upon him as a subject for investigation and analysis. And the amounts of criticism which are now being written about Lemkin and his work are really quite enormous. His name, now restored somewhat to conversations about the history and politics of genocide, does still call out for greater recognition, and his work and his influence greater scrutiny. While he lived, for those who knew him, he was both admired and shunned. He had both enthusiastic followers and was really much criticized, when, of course, he was acknowledged at all. He had no permanent job. He worked in what we call today as an adjunct at Yale. I make much in the play of the correspondence which is found in his files, a large fraction of which comes from bill collectors who are dunning him for money. small amounts, large amounts, threats to sell his furniture at auction. He never had a real income and lived, as I suppose many academics do, on foundation grants and those other little jobs that you can get. His treaty, however, is the foundational document of an entire field of international law central to understanding political theory and practice to our current day. It should come as no surprise to us that a number of commentators have declared his treaty a failure and in need of rewriting, and of course they have evidence of the continuing worldwide genocides to verify their opinion. In fact, Article 16 of the treaty provides a mechanism for revising it. It would be, I think, foolish in the extreme to try and jettison the whole thing, and to tinker with it now doesn't make much sense. But there are a number of people who are attempting, because of the recognition of how far the treaty has fallen from success, to attempt to make it do something which it always wanted to do, to stop, prevent, and punish genocide. Some of you may know the name Greg Stanton, who runs, was chair, I don't know if he's still director of Genocide Watch. But at a conference some months ago, we met again, and he presented a paper, or some papers, that together with a young colleague of his from the university, I think in Montreal, proposed a extension of Lemkin's treaty to recognize the fact that the mechanisms for taking action against genocide were in fact unsuccessful and needed some other mechanism to be better suited to the goal. In writing my play, the historical information derived from Lemkin's writings and correspondence is used to provide the context for his personal struggle. The struggle that ran parallel or together with his public agenda. Plays, because they focus on character rather than idea, though they contain ideas too, of course, and mighty ones, challenge the writer to create a stage personality that is interesting and credible, one often in conflict with forces both internal and external. With historical characters, in theater as well as in film, a way has to be found to make them dynamic and as compelling too. In a note that I wrote to the play, I said that Lemkin's thinking was determined by his status as an intellectual and as an outsider. Perhaps the question I was most determined to answer for myself as a playwright, knowing now much about Lemkin and his personality, I thought and hoped, is to ask myself, what is it that would have made Lemkin laugh? Or at least smile? I found one part of the answer to this question in Lemkin's own love of languages. And thus the play has a number of puns and word games to provide some comic relief to this generally unhappy story. And so when we took the play and we put it into Spanish, German, Polish, and Hebrew, the translators did heroic work in making these puns comprehensible and accessible to audiences who possess a different language and popular culture than the Americans for whom I wrote the play originally. To be sure, I don't think everybody gets everything. But as writers, as some of you may know, we are in the eternal debt to translators who are, of course, great writers themselves, especially when they deal with your work. Of course. I'll talk to you, if you're interested, a little bit about this to give you an example of how we tried to make some transpositions linguistically and seeing if it came out successfully. The play, by the way, still awaits its premieres in Polish, German, and Hebrew. We may have a Hebrew premiere in the spring. The Spanish translation was premiered in Cuba in 2010 and had a very successful few days of performing readings in Lima in Peru. superb translator that did the work. There are then as well other characters in this play with whom Lemkin interacts and who are historical figures, and as audiences come to realize, lived at times incompatible with chronology logically understood. But as they also come to understand when dealing with an elastic time period in the subjective mind of the protagonist, that the theater allows liberties to be taken with logic while the deeper psychology of character is investigated. Thus, the structure of the play is peripatetic, wandering through Lemkin's imagination on the day before his death, resulting in impossible encounters. Yes, you know, you've seen this before, not in my play, but in plays that use this technique and this structure. Thus, in If the Whole Body Dies, there are clues throughout the text that identify a character who's called in the cast of characters the girl. The girl, by intention, is Anne Frank, murdered 4 years before Lemkin's treaty. And if you were my approximate age, so it is when we did our early readings to put the play in its final form at the university, I always remember this moment. We had talkbacks with the audiences to get their feedback about how they received the play. And I have a wonderful colleague in the German department. She teaches Dutch in the German department, who teaches a course in Anne Frank. And so when an early when the narrator says at the beginning, it's above on the upstage wall, we see a slide from Prinsengracht, 263 Amsterdam, wham. Of course, they don't know any more. That's going to be Anne Frank in the play. But I had a colleague, too, from anthropology, you know, who when the play was over, and this is, he's a good friend, you know, he said in the discussion, when someone said, oh, and I liked Anne Frank or whatever else, he said, Anne Frank? Really? So this is a moment, if you will, intentionally put into the play of discovery. And all of us like that, whether we're reading mystery novels or whatever else, when we come up, that's who it is. You know, it was Mr. Plum with the candlestick in the pantry or whatever you want to talk about. So there's another historical character, and if you were, I say, my approximate age, he says, looking around. If you were my approximate age and a citizen of Wisconsin in the last third of the last century, you would certainly have familiar with an eccentric figure of one of Wisconsin's long-serving politicians. His name, William Proxmire. Has anybody heard of William Proxmire here? I hope a few of you have. Excellent. All right. Who came to the Senate in 1957, and who, like Lemkin, was a loner, for different reasons, however. In 1965, when he became aware, this is now 6 years after Lemkin's death, when he became aware of Lemkin's treaty, I call it Lemkin's treaty, though of course he was the figure behind the writing of the treaty. He didn't write the actual words. There was a committee in the United Nations to do this. But he was the inspiration behind it. And so Proxmire became the relentless driving force behind the treaty's ratification. To that end, he fulfilled his promise, Proxmire, to speak in the well of the Senate every day it was in session until the ratification was voted and approved. And the final total was 3,211 speeches by William Proxmire. They're available, and you can check them out if you're interested at the Wisconsin Historical Society. He didn't write them, all of them. They're all different, but his aides wrote them. But still, it was a determined and a relentless effort on his part to get the treaty approved. In the time when I was researching and writing the play, I was absolutely delighted to find that Senator Proxmire and Raphael Lemkin have certain, I felt, overlapping aspects to their personalities. The balding Proxmire, if you lived in Wisconsin at the time and you read the Wisconsin State Journal, the paper of record, you would be familiar with pictures of Proxmire above the fold, as they say in the second section, with what was known then as hair plugs. His head looked like a really unweeded garden, and it was really kind of bizarre to see them, but he was very proud of his, the revivification of his scalp. Now, why does they say this? Why would this anecdote be of meaning? One time in the 50s when, in conversation, Lemkin said, and was noted to have said, that there were three things he feared when he would grow older: becoming a refugee, wearing glasses, and losing his hair. Okay, Raphael and Bill, you've got something to talk about. Proxmire died in 2005 on the day we had the first reading of the play at the University of Wisconsin. The actor who was playing was a little shaken by all this, but he did have a nice head of hair, I remember that. In an important way, Lemkin and Proxmire find a certain enjoyment and respect for each other as the play proceeds, in particular their unshakable perseverance in pursuing a cause once it had been undertaken. The historian at Yale, Jay Winter, sees Lemkin as the archetypal hedgehog in Isaiah Berlin's formulation, a man who knows one thing and only one thing and knows it with his whole being. In a way, the play's chronological jumps dramatize Lemkin's continuous movement during the last 15 years of his life as he made his way back and forth over the Atlantic in the early years of the United Nations. The stress of traveling did much to impair his health, and his physical condition was often dire. Let me give you a little speech of Lemkin's. This is from early in the play. Lemkin ruminates and talks, talking to the audience, of course, in these speeches. And what we hear on tape is, first is some music from Quo Vadis. This is a famous novel that Lemkin read in the early first years of his life in Poland. Polish novel by Henryk Sienkiewicz about the destruction of the Christians, yes, by the Romans. It was this formative novel. In fact, we have a tape of him in a radio interview saying in the 50s that everybody has a favorite memory of a book he or she read. In my case, it's Quo Vadis. So we have in the play, at strategic moments, music from the triumphant march of Quo Vadis. Anybody see this film, remember this film? Lost to history. Ah, Marianne, excellent, excellent. You want to get a good chuckle or two, or maybe more, check this out. There must be some down-and-out film libraries with old VHS tapes somewhere selling this thing or renting this thing out. It's a hoot. It's a hoot. But the sound then is used in the play to make ironic commentary on Lemkin and his difficulties. So he hears a piece of a dialogue from this tape. It's spoken by Peter Ustinov, one of the great comedians of his time, a British actor, saying, "When I have finished with these Christians, Petronius, Roman emperor, history may never know that they existed." Very plummy in his accent. And then Lemkin, having heard this in his imagination, but we hear it in the audience, says, "That is the issue, Petronius, the maniacs of history, how to stop them. I have the answer now in law. The law can do what nothing else is capable of. The law is our best protector. And I have a wonderful friend in the Senate now." Oh, no, not the Roman one. Proxmire in Washington. He will help me get the ratification. History may never know that they existed. He turns off the radio, which is giving him this music. How will people know about the Jews if they're finished off? By what we leave to history that we created. Not our blood, not our suffering, our books, our brains, our dreams. Hatikva. That's the name in Hebrew. It's means our hope. It's the national anthem of Israel. Humanity is enlarged by the contributions of all. Killing one group diminishes all. That film was terrible and funny at the same time. No, not Quo Vadis. It got 8 nominations. No, Hitler's film, where the Jews are the plague that threatens the Aryan people. A race of parasites, it said. Parasites. 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 2 footnotes. That's a bad pun, but it's intense. He laughs at his own joke. Their homelessness is a matter of choice, it said, as if I choose to live like this and here, though I live here now with less of a home than I deserve, but more than $25 a week is not possible. The Eternal Jew was the film. The ewige Jude. Ewig. We are a head-covering people. Not a bad pun. We assimilate and destroy from within forever foreign bodies, regardless of appearance. It says, so I bought a white suit with white shoes and white socks, all of which I wore with a dark tie in order to attend the dinners I was invited to. In America, I saw that one first cut a piece of meat, then put the knife on the plate, shifted the fork to the other hand, and ate it. This did not fit well into my notions of American economy, and it slowed down the eating process considerably. We are like rats, it said. No, we are rats that migrate everywhere, cunning, cowardly, cruel. What if my house be troubled by a rat? Einstein is the relativity Jew, but I have no more relatives. Jewish blood will never pollute the germination. Isn't that what Nero said, Mama? So you were murdered. Is that why they hate us? Is that why they hate me? I can give you no reason, nor will I not more than a lodged hate and a certain loathing. That last line, of course, is not Lemkins, it's Shylock's. Oh, hello. Would you like a copy of the play? In fact, there are 2 public struggles that Lemkin is obsessed with, one following up on the other. I have to keep my eye on the time. One was the ratification of the treaty in the United Nations at a time when the organization was creating itself on the world stage. The second was the struggle to have the United States, the country that Lemkin adopted and that adopted him, to ratify the treaty. He was successful in the first, but not in the second, and his disappointment over the fierce and protracted effort he waged for ratification brought him many enemies, some of whom were once his helpful allies who he thought had turned against him. We have here too public opposition and rebuke that Lemkin endured and was augmented by his personal condition. His relentless self-assumed mission that provides more visible side of his turbulent career and that helps to understand Lemkin's moments of unpleasantness and vanity in the play contain a deeply private dimension. These moments were grounded in Lemkin's status as an outsider, a prominent trope often used to define Jews in the world, which I believe he felt profoundly and painfully. The condition was caused by many factors. He was a refugee among natural-born Americans, a highly educated professional living at the sufferance of inadequate and under-remunerated employment, a Jew with an accent among the plain-spoken, often anti-Semitic Gentiles, and what I believe to be his condition as a closeted gay man. Nobody has commented on this. It's all right, I have. This idea about vanity becomes important because it helps to create this character who are trying to grapple with on stage as a stage character, which is, I take that from someone who didn't want to wear glasses or lose his hair. This is all part of the way that people construct for themselves their identity and who they are and what they want to know. I've written elsewhere about the particular special ability of the theater to do anti-genocidal work. And what better place for this idea than a play concerned with the man who, without any formal political authority and power, a kind of temporary man, as Willie Loman in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman describes himself, was able more than anyone before or since to mobilize the international community to rise and resist via treaty the onslaught of group annihilation. With the ghastly memory of the murder of 49 members of his own family always before him, Lemkin was compelled to use his extraordinary intellect and powerful skills of persuasion to compel the devastated post-war world to commit itself to a goal that still eludes us today. As I have noted, he was wide-ranging, both intellectually and geographically. He believed with all his wounded heart in the law, that it was the law that could be anchored to the prohibitions and penalties for engaging in genocide. In a distinct way, he hoped to stay apart from the nasty minutiae of political engagements, deceiving himself that the power and purity of his cause would bring triumph to a damaged world and to his own increasingly frail body. Samantha Power adds a sour conclusion to Lemkin's life when she writes about his final approval of the treaty in the Senate. She writes, "It had finally ratified the Genocide Convention, but when the President and the Senate got their first chance to enforce the law, strategic and domestic political concerns caused them to side with the genocide regime of Saddam Hussein. Far from making the United States more likely to do more to stop genocide, ratification seemed only to make the United States officials more cautious about using the term." I don't want to talk about that now, but it's something we can talk about. Towards the end of her book, her assessment is more positive, but it's still too stingy. She writes, "Raphael Lemkin's coinage has done more good than harm." Thank you very much, Samantha Power. It was the Canadian politician and academic Michael Ignatieff, in an essay he wrote called "The Legacy of Raphael Lemkin," who identified what I believe to be Lemkin's most important and compelling contribution to the prevention of genocide, what he calls the supreme act of the moral imagination. In other words, why should one group of people care for another's welfare? Specifically and historically, what do Armenians and Darfurians owe to each other? Rwandans and Bosniaks, Cambodians and Jews. The true importance of Lemkin's treaty, I believe, lies in its reinterpretation of the common wisdom and common practice of caring for our own, if not exclusively, then certainly as a first priority. The Treaty Against Genocide, in fact, establishes an entirely new standard for determining, judging, and punishing violence, because it relies on nothing other than an acknowledged, selfless concern for the humanity of those to whom we owe nothing. Realizing this allows us to recognize how extraordinary was his successful crusade to get his treaty ratified, because it was and is a border-crossing, indeed border-obliterating universal instrument. As I said, to be sure, there are new approaches and concerns that have been formulated since his death, in particular theories and declarations about how to prevent genocide before it occurs. If you know something about R2P, responsibility to protect, this is an issue here. But this achievement of this wandering Jew stands, though we must acknowledge that for reasons political it has largely failed. Just this week, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I just got it on my computer yesterday, released its evaluative report called Atrocity Prevention at the Crossroads, assessing the President's Atrocity Prevention Board 2 years after. You may know that President Obama 2 years ago established an Atrocities Prevention Board, the APB. This is an assessment of it. I did a very, very, very quick scan of 30 pages or so, and nowhere, only once is the word genocide used. We have other words used instead, which of course is proving somewhat Samantha Power's point. Finally, and when he died semi-anonymously, the glass of his cause was both half empty and half full, and that is how I leave Lemkin at the end of my play, both semi-heroic and deeply flawed in the sense of his resemblance to us, that man in the shadows. In despondent moments, he felt himself an outcast, and the feeling was surely in part self-induced. To be sure, his family was mostly destroyed, and the memory of them drove him on. But he was also detached from any permanent place, too, not finding either comfort in post-war Poland and not in the new Zionist state of Israel, about which he had very little to say. And not anywhere in America, though he certainly appreciated its commitment to the idea of freedom and justice, however imperfectly it practiced it. Ignatieff says that Lemkin dealt with disposition by taking refuge in the law. The only place he could belong, he says. His passion for the law was an expression, in a sense, of his homelessness, which, as I say, is another way to describe his wandering with firm purpose. And thus I conclude my introduction to the play, and I conclude this talk to you today thus. Raphael Lemkin, ingesting heart medication in a cheap Manhattan walk-up, depressed that his adopted country refused to accept his plan to stop genocide, hounded by bill collectors and sustained by a few friends and not a little vanity, was battered by storms, internal and outside himself. But in the darkness of another tempest, this one Shakespeare's, I hear, as he must have felt, Miranda's immediate empathic connection, watching the visitors shipped to the island battered by the furious waves. Oh, I have suffered with those I saw suffer, she says. Oh, the cry did knock against my very heart.
Thank you very much. Now we open the floor for questions.
I'm Larry Glazer, and you and I are roommates for about 10 minutes every Tuesday and Thursday. What would you have us make certain our students grasp about Lemkin beyond the term if we wanted to get to the core of what you think?
Well, I suppose there are several lessons to take from Lemkin, and the one I think people will grab onto is, of course, this issue of perseverance in the face of opposition. We talk a lot about, and you may or may not believe it, I tend not to believe it, but Lemkin might be the exception or one of those outliers, that if you push on the door hard enough, somehow it will open, despite all the multitudes behind it trying to keep you out. And Lemkin managed to do this with a courage, I think, and an awareness of the risk it involved, both to him in his mission as well as in his own health. So I think this is a lesson for students to learn, to keep driving on, though people may consider you to be loony or off the mark or retrograde or whatever, you still can do it. Another lesson to learn, I would say, and what better to tell students, get an education. Learn 11 languages. Start there, right? And know a lot about what it is you need a lot about to do the things you have to do. Just wanting something by itself doesn't get you there, though it'll help you get there, because you have to know how to do that. And so that's where education comes in, no matter what field you're in, no matter what you do, right? I guess the third thing if we work off the play, and you're not, of course, obliged to do that, but to say that through the arts we can know things, we can get information, we can supply ourselves with information and knowledge, and allow ourselves to be emotionally connected to important things, important ideas. And although you may want to learn more about and should learn about Lemkin's mission and Lemkin himself, you can learn about just about anything if you stick with the arts in a way that will be different than what you might learn in a class, maybe in history or political science, and talking about these issues. They're not enemies to the story, but they provide a kind of emotional infrastructure that allows a deepening, a more profound experience with the major issues of our time, which literature has always taken upon itself to discuss and reveal.
Hi, I'm Mike Dickerman.
Hi, Mike.
Bob, did he have... Oh, sorry. Yes. Did Lemkin have any friends? And I don't ask that flippantly. Did he have the emotional capability of connecting with another? I've not heard anything about the deepness of a person. Was that part of him, or was that missing in his makeup?
Well, it's a perfect question to ask someone who was to write about Lemkin and create a character of him. I believe yes. For instance, Power says in a book, in an aside, she says he never had a sense of humor. Well, Lemkin. But if you look at his autobiography, you'll see that, in fact, there is almost a kind of puckish awareness, certainly of ironies, but also of the interesting correspondences and digressions that come in through people's culture and language. And so he has so many things to say about people all over the world, you know, about the Romanians, the Mongolians, and he knows all the histories, so then he starts then to ruminate upon these, and they're very, to me, they're humorous, and I think they're intended to be, so there's an observer standing behind. Specifically, no, he had no friends that I know about, though he had, I think, a yearning to be connected somewhere, somehow. This is part of the blight on his world that left him so unconnected because of the destruction of his family. I say he had a brother in Montreal, but he also had several families. There was one in Long Island, and there was one in New Jersey. You know, people, professional men at that time who had families with children. And he would visit them for a kind of way to relax over a weekend, and the times he could do that. I feel through this, you could feel that there's a yearning somehow to be connected in a way he couldn't. There are also some interesting passages in the autobiography about his relationships with women, which always turn out badly. And this is partly which leads me to my mentioning of what I believe to be Lemkin's homosexuality. There's an anecdote told that somehow he's fixed up on a date. A lot of women were interested in him, by the way, professional women, and several of them, and I've seen the correspondence, you know, they're really seriously after moving this relationship along. But Lemkin seems to have little or no interest in doing that. One anecdote has to do, he was fixed up or somehow went dancing. Lemkin, it's hard even for me to imagine Lemkin at a dance, but he was at a dance with a woman, and I think she was South American, and clearly a dish, as you would say in the 50s, right? And it comes to naught very quickly because he describes it, he's writing this, how he couldn't fully engage with her because he just needed to talk about genocide and she just didn't want to hear about it. So I think, yes, it's there, but how one deals with this and what this means, of course, it can make for a very sad character. But I say, I find this question I asked myself about what would made him smile and finding the answer for me through language and languages is an important component in filling out and making more complete a character for the stage.
Hello, I'm Marianne Hassong. I'm really intrigued by the haunting gaze of this human face up here, and I wonder if you could tell us how this image wound up on the cover of your play.
Sure. In 1978, I went to Poland for my first visit to Poland, and the last one until just last year, to see the sites of the annihilation of the Jews. And while there for 2.5 weeks, I was kind of adopted by a family whom I knew was given their name by someone I knew in Wisconsin. I was I'll do this as shortly as I can. I was staying at a bed and breakfast somewhere in Warsaw with a woman who spoke Polish and French, and I spoke Spanish and some German and some, you know, and so we couldn't communicate at all. So after breakfast, I'd go up to their house, this family's house, and last name Dienerman. They became my hosts, my money changes. I'd leave $20 on a napkin and then come back the next morning, a big stack of złotys about that high. And they had a son named Waldemar for short. He was a painter. He had just graduated from the Polish Academy of Art. To me, he was just a brilliant young artist. And after I came back to the States after the visit, he took me around. We drove around in this beat-up old Lada. They weren't Lada, but good name. To Majdanek and other places. He drove me. He wrote to me and said, "Bob, I can't stand this anymore." Poland was still communist then. I said, I can't paint. I can't be creative here. Help me what you can to get out of Poland. So I spent a year or two handling, as they say in Yiddish, trying to make a connection, and so forth. And wouldn't you know it, about 2 years later, Waldeck Wienermann had a job as a professor of painting at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, just down the road from where I live in Madison. Right? It was one of the, for me, it's one of the wonderful things of a life that you can manage to get something like this happen. Well, anyway, so Waldeck, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, he lived for 18 months in a cellar that had ventilation from one tiny window. Lived there at the sufferance of the person whose cellar this was. They had to somehow find a way to get him money to keep him going by the week. They did. They outlasted the war and survived. So Waldeck began to paint about the Holocaust. He's had several shows, and now he doesn't have anything to do with it. He doesn't even do painting anymore. He's still teaching. He'll be retired in a couple of years. This is the answer now for long preamble to your question. On a triptych which he painted, which is the size of this wall, in the corner of one place, there's that image. And Waldeck, who I asked, could I use it for the play and for the other books I wrote, he said, absolutely, take whatever you want. So that's the image of Waldeck Wienermann, and he's a fabulous artist and a good friend. So even great. The title, by the way, is from a work by Primo Levi, and one of the great Holocaust writers, and that's where the genesis of the title comes from.
We have time for another question.
Huh. What a great first row we have here. Whoa, I love it, I love it.
I'm Elisa von Jordan-Forgy, and I want to thank you very much for this wonderful presentation on Raphael Lemkin. And one of the things that has always interested me about Lemkin is the gentleness that he displayed in Axis rule in occupied Europe, in breaking down all of the techniques of genocide, right, that the Nazis were then using, but then genocidaires more generally, was the argument he was making, could use. The gentleness he displayed in thinking about what makes a group, why groups are important, right? It allowed him to see things that even now are not current in the scholarship on genocide, spiritual techniques of genocide, moral techniques of genocide, biological is still not discussed so much, but more recently. But he identified very early on the separation of the sexes as a genocidal technique, right? And this has only been sort of rediscovered recently. So in a way, he's still our best thinker on genocide. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the milieu he grew up in and the world he came from, and how that may have influenced this incredible insightfulness, the genuine humanist, right, passion, I think, that drove so much of what he did as well.
Well, I could say a few words that will endorse your statement. He was born in 1900 in rural area of Poland, in a town not too far from the major city of Białystok, which suffered a pogrom in 1906 against Jews. He was always, and he writes the first chapters of the autobiography all talk about, he talks about his affinity for loneliness. He sees himself as being someone different than the other boys, not hostile to them, but it's just that his heart is so big, as this issue with Quo Vadis, that he asks his mother, Why didn't nobody say anything when these people were being slaughtered? It's the question, of course, that he answered in his life's work. I will say something. And he repeats these anecdotes all the time. And he's now 7, 9, 11, 15. As we watch him in these brief several chapters, we'll watch him grow up and explore himself in the world he lives in. His family had a Jewish home. They weren't overly religious, but he certainly knew the Jewish rituals and issues having to do with a practice of Judaism. And he then went, as so many Jews did, to find the answers to himself by going to be educated. And that's where he sets out to be a student, and then PhDs, and then forever. Dirk Moses, who writes about coins this phrase groupism, or uses it. That somehow early on, Lemkin, as he's thinking and refining about this work that he does, thinks in terms of groups. Less so than in terms of individuals. And he thinks of groups, or the effect of this is because he was determined somehow to see the ultimate value of culture. Culture becomes for him the central piece of maintenance and continuance of a people. And when genocide is committed, what he could not accept was the destruction of culture. I referred to this in that speech I gave. What do the Jews leave behind? Not the blood, not our getting killed, it's our culture, the culture. And through this culture, he sees the continuance and the flourishing of peoples. So that he called this in the 1930s in his political work when he went to the League of Nations, or didn't go to the League of Nations but sent his picture, his paper. He had two phrases that were ultimately, by the 1940s, expunged from his thinking because they were non-starters. One was barbarism, and one was vandalism. The vandalism issue had to do with culture. And he always, I think, and there was no way to find that, to put that into this treaty that he helped to write. But through everything that he wrote, there is the understanding that it is culture of people that has to survive for the people to survive. He believed it and he lived it.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Skloot for really a very interesting lecture. So if you join me in... And I want to invite you to come again on September the 30th for Lillian Hussong, who will be speaking, right here she is, who will be speaking about LGBT and Uganda and about the potential for genocide there. So again, thank you all, and thank you, Dr. Skloot.